Today, we're going to look at 4 terrifying stories that will make you question what's real and what isn't. I think you guys are really going to love this episode because each one is just so different. And when you think you know where each one is going, they take unexpected twists that will leave you wondering what's really out there. You won't want to miss this one. On the morning of September 14th, 2023, Sergeant Mitch Madden of the Crook County Sheriff's Department pulled his patrol car onto a dusty access road leading to the Thompson Cattle Ranch in eastern Oregon. As he drove down the gravel path, he could see 3 other police vehicles already parked near a cluster of officers standing in the field. The rancher, Bill Thompson, was pointing towards something in the distance. Sergeant Madden quickly parked his car and walked over to the group. Even though it was September and it was starting to cool down, the officers there were already sweating. As Madden got closer, he could see why. About 50 feet away lay a 1,200-pound black Angus cow. The animal was on its side, and even from this distance, Madden could tell this wasn't a normal livestock death. The rancher told the officers he had found the cow early that morning during his routine check. At first, he thought maybe it had been attacked by coyotes or mountain lions, but when he investigated, he knew that it was different. The cow's eyes, reproductive organs, and part of its jaw had been removed with surgical precision. There was no blood anywhere around, no signs of a struggle, or any tracks leading to or from the body. Officers who examined the scene were equally disturbed and confused. One of the deputies pointed how clean the cuts were, like they'd been done with a laser. Others noted how the grass wasn't even bent or disturbed. It appeared as if the animal had been dropped from a great height. This was the 6th cattle mutilation in Crook County in the past year alone, and each case followed the same pattern. Back at his patrol car, Sergeant Madden called Keith Carson, who was a local veterinarian who had examined 3 of the previous mutilated cattle. Keith explained that in his 30 years of veterinary practice, he'd never seen anything like these cases. The cuts were just too precise to be from predators, in addition to all the other strange things. And Keith had worked with the FBI on similar cases in the 70s. He had examined mutilated cattle in Nebraska, where farmers had reported strange lights in the sky on the night their animals were killed. The cuts back then were identical to what he was seeing now in every way, and he knew that they were somehow connected. Well, a week after finding the mutilated cow, Bill Thompson sat in Sergeant Madden's office describing how the incident had affected his ranch, and his other cattle wouldn't go near that part of the pasture anymore. Even his dogs refused to approach the area, and he had lost 3 more cows in the past month. They had simply vanished, and so he was now doing armed patrols of his property at night, but it didn't make him feel any safer. Things were worse inside the home. He was robbed of his peace, his children were having nightmares almost nightly, and his wife was at her breaking point and wanted to sell the ranch and move to the city. Disturbingly, other ranchers in the area were experiencing the same problems. Jim Baker, who owned the neighboring ranch, told officers his cattle had been acting strange for weeks before he found one of them dead. The animals would bunch together at night, facing outward in a defensive circle. They would become agitated for no apparent reason. Even his most docile cows had become aggressive and skittish. It was all very strange. Now at this point, the Crook County Sheriff's Department was simply overwhelmed, because not only were they not equipped to handle this in terms of training and budget, but they weren't even sure where to start. They had increased patrols in rural areas, but with hundreds of square miles to cover and limited resources, they knew they couldn't protect every ranch. So they had reached out to the FBI for help, but the federal response was very limited. Shocker there, right? However, there were similar cases happening in other states, and no one seemed to have any answers. Local veterinarians and other animal experts from Oregon State University had examined tissue samples from 2 of the mutilated cattle. Here's the twist. It appeared that the cuts had been made with a tool that simultaneously cut and cauterized the wound, technology that should not exist outside of advanced medical facilities. Additionally, unusual chemical compounds were found in the tissue. The only clear pattern was that each mutilation occurred during the new moon when nights were darkest. Now, in response to this, ranchers had begun installing infrared cameras and motion sensors on their properties. Some had even hired private security, while others had simply sold their herds and left the business altogether. Not only were there no answers ever found, but cases just like this one continue up to this very day. And folks, it gets worse. Similar mutilations have been reported in Argentina, England, and Australia. Whatever was happening in Crook County that year was part of a pattern that stretched back decades and spanned continents. After all these years of investigation, we still don't know who or what is responsible. However, if you do plan on hiking in the Pacific Northwest, despite everything you've heard, you're probably going to want to gear up properly. And that's why I've started using Bombas. Look, when you're potentially running from unexplained phenomena in the woods, the last thing you want is uncomfortable socks slowing you down. Trust me, I learned that the hard way on a camping trip that we won't get into that right now.
You really need to be careful what
I know
saying.
I'm not going to say anything.
Right,
I know. I don't want to get sued either.
But
No,
I'm just saying
we're good. We're good. I promise. What I love about Bombas is they're engineered for maximum comfort and performance. The honeycomb arch support system and seamless toe actually make a huge difference when you're putting in miles on the trail or making a hasty retreat from whatever that sound was behind that tree. Plus, their moisture wickling technology keeps your feet dry, which is crucial in the Pacific Northwest, whether you're crossing streams or, let's just say, having to wade through a marsh at 3 a.m. But what makes me feel even better about wearing them is that for every pair purchased, they donate a pair to someone experiencing homelessness. Essential items like socks are among the most requested at shelters, and Bombas has donated over 75 million items to date. In fact, new customers get 20% off their first purchase at bombas.com/lurks using code LURKS at checkout. And while I can't guarantee they'll help you outrun whatever's in the woods, they definitely won't hurt your chances. On the evening of July 15th, 2023, a 23-year-old named Marcus pulled his converted Sprinter van into a dispersed camping spot right near Mount Rainier National Park. He'd just come from a van life meetup near Washington, where about 30 other van lifers had gathered to share stories and compare their vehicles. Since he was so close to Mount Rainier, he figured he might as well find the perfect spot in the forest for the night. The spot he found was down a fire road about 4 miles from the entrance. Most van lifers knew these spots well because they were marked on apps shared in Facebook groups. And so Marcus pulled into a clearing and began his usual evening routine. He had all the ingredients ready to make carne asada tacos, and he downloaded some movies to watch for later. This was pretty typical. He spent most weekends camping in his van somewhere in Washington state doing this. And he was equipped well. He had a full kitchen setup with a propane stove, a sink with running water, and solar panels on the roof to power all of it. And so after parking, he decided he was going to explore the area around the campsite. Even though it was nice, there was some trash scattered like beer cans and food wrappers. But beyond that bit of trash, there seemed to be this nice little winding path that led down to the riverbank. And so he decided he was going to go explore it. Now, every half hour or so, another vehicle would drive past looking for their own camping spot. And this was pretty normal for summer evenings because a lot of people were trying to find free camping spots before dark. And so after a while of Marcus not really finding anything too exciting, he just went back to his van and started making dinner. And with the sun low enough in the sky where it's dark now, and he already contacted his family to let him know where he was, he began hearing some odd noises. It sounded like cannon fire, deep, booming sounds that would kind of just reverberate through the valley every few seconds. Along with that came what sounded like a chainsaw, closer but still far away enough that he couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Now, he wasn't immediately alarmed because just living in the area, he knew it wasn't too unusual to hear gunshots while camping. I mean, lots of people shoot guns out in target practice in these areas, and, well, chainsaws are fairly common too, people cutting firewood. Now, one of the first things that came to Marcus's mind was an RV that he'd seen earlier pulling out, along with several other campers who had just settled in, and they seemed concerned. And so the real question is, why were they so intent on leaving after they found a great spot? Marcus became paranoid about this, and he just made sure that his windows and doors were locked as he tried to settle down for the night. What happened next was something Marcus could only describe as hazy and disorienting. His memories of that night were fragmented, like trying to remember pieces of a dream. The first thing he remembered was being awake in complete darkness, desperately trying to breathe. It wasn't like choking. His lungs were filling with air, but it felt like he was drowning. He remembered the overwhelming panic, the desperate need for oxygen. He had a vague memory of trying to punch out one of his van windows and then stumbling toward the side doors to get them open. After that, everything went black. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in his bed with sunlight streaming through the windows. At first, Marcus thought maybe it had just been a nightmare, but when he looked around his van, he saw clear evidence that something had happened during the night. The damage was extensive, and several of his window blinds were completely shredded. One window had deep scratch marks on the inside. Even the ceiling air vent was destroyed, and all the damage was done from inside. Marcus's knuckles were bruised and swollen, and his feet were sore, probably from kicking the cabinets in his panic. A metal pole he used for his awning was lying broken in the middle of the floor. None of it made sense. The van had been well ventilated and his carbon monoxide detector hadn't gone off. There were no signs of forced entry. Well, a few months earlier, in March, Marcus had been camping with his friends Kurt and Melissa in almost the exact same area. They'd gotten a tip from a local gas station about some pretty good dispersed camping spots up on the mountain. It had already been dark when they were looking for a spot. Not ideal, but they were tired and just wanted to set up camp. After passing several muddy, uneven spots, they finally settled on what seemed like the least terrible option. Marcus helped Kurt and Melissa set up their tent while telling them about his newly converted van. He was excited to test it out. He'd only had it for a few weeks at that point. The spot they chose was strange. Kurt and Melissa started calling it the ominous slant. That night, strange things would happen. Melissa told Marcus the next morning that she'd heard what sounded like someone wearing a squeaking latex suit walking around their tent. She called whatever it was the Happy Gimper. But for Kurt, he swore he heard a bear. Now, at some point in the night, both Melissa and Kurt heard Marcus screaming from inside his van. Not just yelling, but the kind of scream that made them think someone was being murdered. Kurt had stumbled out of his tent and rushed over to Marcus's van, throwing open the doors, but when he got there, Marcus was just sleeping. So Kurt woke him up and asked him what was wrong, but Marcus had no idea what he was talking about. He had no memory of screaming or having any nightmares. The screaming and now this latest episode had both occurred near Mount Rainier. This story feels like something straight out of the Twilight Zone, but interestingly, several park rangers who work around Mount Rainier just refer to it as the mountain, like it's the only one that matters. And of course, this isn't even going into half of the legends and lore surrounding the mountain and just the plethora of stories and UFOs and other strange things that go on. I think there's a reason Marcus initially sensed something was off that day when he camped by himself, but unfortunately, we'll never know what happened. I ask you, the viewer, was this something he did by himself, or is there something strange going on? I would love to know your thoughts. Marcus refuses to camp anywhere near Mount Rainier again. Many moons ago, on the morning of October 12th, 1886, a construction foreman named James Wilson stood at the edge of Seattle's oldest cemetery, watching as his crew began the delicate work of exhuming old graves. The city had decided to convert this burial ground into what would become Denny Park, and Wilson's team was responsible for carefully relocating each of the remains. Wilson had overseen dozens of similar projects before, and he knew exactly what to expect when digging these graves up. The wooden coffins would be partially rotted, with the remains mostly decomposed, and so his team would carefully transfer everything to new caskets for reburial at a different location. Everything was going smoothly. His crew had already successfully relocated several graves, and they were now approaching a grave marked for one Mary Ann Conklin. who had died back in 1873. As it turns out, Wilson knew about Conklin because he had read about her in the newspaper before. She had run Seattle's first hotel in the 1850s and apparently had quite the reputation. The crew began digging, but they noticed something odd. When they got down to the coffin level, their shovels would easily slice through the softened wood, but this time, their tools were hitting something much more solid. The workers had to use considerably more force just to expose the coffin, and when they finally managed to clear away all the dirt, Wilson knelt down to examine the casket. Despite being buried for 13 years, the wood showed remarkably little decay. They all thought this was odd, but continued with operations. All 6 men struggled greatly to lift it out of the ground due to the immense weight. Wilson had never seen anything like it. He called the crew to gather around as they prepared to open the lid, and when they did, they all took a step back. Instead of the decomposed remains, they found what looked like a perfectly preserved statue of a woman. Her form was intact, but her entire body had turned white as marble and was hard as stone. Wilson reached down and tapped her arm, and it made the same sound as hitting granite. The foreman sent one of his workers to go get a doctor or a scientist, anyone who might be able to explain how a human body could turn to stone. And by that afternoon, dozens had gathered around the cemetery to try to get a look at petrified remains. The newspaper sent over a reporter who couldn't believe it. He kept touching her calcified body, completely baffled by how a corpse could have transformed into what looked like a marble statue. Even her facial features were perfectly preserved, frozen in time like a sculpture. Well, several doctors showed up to examine her, but none of them could explain it. Wilson and his crew eventually had to move her to her new resting place up on Capitol Hill. It took 8 men to carry the coffin, and they had to keep stopping to rest because of how heavy it was. But the story surrounding this woman is strange. Back in 1851, Mary Ann Conklin had arrived in Seattle in a way that immediately got people talking. She had been married to a sea captain who, for reasons no one really knew, had suddenly abandoned her at the port in Port Townsend. Instead of trying to find passage back east, she made her way down to the tiny settlement of Seattle, which at the time was really just a handful of buildings surrounded by woods. And the moment she arrived, she took charge. She just had that manager mentality. She managed to get control of the town's only hotel, which was the Felker House, and it was this 2-story fancy building that had been shipped all the way around South America from the East Coast. At the time, this house stood out because it had actual glass windows, proper furniture, and even curtains. During the day, the hotel operated like any other business. She would rent out rooms to travelers, and she even let the town use some of the spaces as temporary courtrooms. But people in town started noticing strange things about how the hotel operated at night. There were always, men coming and going at odd hours, and Conklin seemed to be making a lot more money than a regular hotel should. And not to mention her explosive temper and language, and Madame Damnable, because of how she'd absolutely tear into anyone who crossed her. In 1856, when tensions were rising between settlers and the local indigenous tribes, the U.S. Navy showed up in Seattle with the sloop of war Decatur to help protect the town. The Navy decided they need to improve this dirt road that ran right past Conklin's hotel, but the moment their men would show up with their tools, she would come charging out like a hurricane. Hell hath no fury like a woman's scorn, they say. She burst out the front door with 3 massive dogs at her heels and her apron loaded up with rocks, and she'd just start hurling these stones at the Navy men while unleashing this string of curses that none of them had ever heard before. The dogs would be going crazy, barking and snapping, ready to attack, and every single time, these trained military men, officers included, would just turn and run away like they were being chased by the devil himself. There's this story going around about how a drunk customer who tried to skip it on his hotel bill, supposedly he was chased 3 blocks down the muddy street and drugged back to the hotel by his caller, all while she described in vivid detail exactly what she was going to do to him if he tried that again. Her reputation got so intense that when the first official map of Seattle was drawn up, they didn't even bother putting Felker House on it. Instead, they just labeled it Madame Damables. She had this uncanny ability to speak multiple languages. She could switch between English, French, Spanish, German, and several Chinese dialects without missing a beat. And for a frontier town in the 1850s, this was practically unheard of. And so the hotel itself became this weird mix of high society and absolute chaos. And because of how much business her hotel was getting, you know what I mean? Like, especially at night when music would start playing and fancy women would appear and all sorts of wealthy men would show up looking for, let's just say, lodging. As you can imagine, she was loaded with cash. And because other businesses in town weren't doing so hot, well, she'd loan money to people in town, and somehow she always knew exactly who would pay her back and who wouldn't. The ones who didn't pay, they left town pretty quickly. And as the story goes, by 1873, she died, but for some strange reason, nobody knew how old she was because she refused to disclose that information. Now, to this day, no one has ever figured out what caused her body to turn to stone. The only explanation people could think of was that maybe even in death, she was still as hard-headed as ever. On a beautiful, warm August morning in 1980, a 32-year-old man named Larry Kelm pulled his pickup truck into a small dirt parking area near Eugene, Oregon. He stepped out of his truck, adjusted his backpack, and began walking toward the trailhead of the Old Malala Indian Trail, which connected Mount Saddle Blanket to the nearby town of Oak Ridge. Now, the Malala Trail had been used by local tribes for centuries before European settlers ever arrived, and by 1980, it had become a very popular hiking destination, especially during the summer months when weather was really nice. The trail itself wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar, which is pretty typical of Oregon wilderness. Larry had hiked parts of this trail before, and he knew that on clear days like this, you could see all the way to the Cascade Mountains. From certain points along the ridge, the morning air was crisp, exactly what you'd expect for an August morning in the Pacific Northwest. One of Larry's favorite parts about the entire hike was that the scent of pine needles was so strong, and for several hours everything seemed completely normal. At one point, Larry began to feel very strange. The forest around him suddenly became unclear, as if he was trying to look through someone else's glasses. All the vibrant greens of the forest faded to gray, even though Larry could still see the sun overhead. It was like someone had draped a massive shadow over this section of the trail. But there was nothing above that could cast such a shadow. Larry stopped walking and blinked several times, maybe thinking something was wrong with his eyesight. But the haziness only persisted, and he looked down at his hands, and even though they appeared slightly out of focus, he knew this wasn't right. The whole world around him had become like a photograph that someone else failed to develop properly. Then, as quickly as it began, Larry passed through what felt like an invisible barrier. When his vision cleared, everything had changed. Instead of mid-morning in a familiar Oregon forest, he was what it appeared to be the middle of the night. The wind that had been blowing through the trees had stopped, and he turned in a circle, trying to get his bearings. The Douglas firs and cedars were gone, and in their place was dense, unfamiliar vegetation that reminded him like a tropical jungle rather than the Pacific Northwest. Even the air felt thick and humid. Despite there being no moon in the sky, he could still see everything around him clearly. It was as if the darkness was somehow illuminated by an unseen light. Now suddenly, a high-pitched sound cut through the air. It wasn't like anything he had ever heard before. Not a bird call or an animal cry or even machinery. The sound seemed to bore directly into his own head, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Someone, or something, whispered the word, "Gotcha," right next to his right ear, and his entire body went cold. His heart seemed to stop for a moment, and he had to force himself to take a breath of the thick, heavy air, and he immediately began backing away, trying to retrace his steps, and as he moved backward, something reached for him from behind. Larry caught sight of it right over his shoulder, his right shoulder, a large, dark, hairy arm ending in a hand with pale, almost human-like fingernails. They appeared clean and well-maintained, but the thumb was positioned lower on the hand than a human's would be. The arm was muscular and covered in coarse black hair. Its thumb actually grazed Larry's neck as he jerked backward, but it didn't break the skin. Larry watched as the hand closed on the empty space where his throat had been just a split second before. Larry kept moving backward, and suddenly he was back in the normal world. The familiar forest surrounded him again, and he could breathe. However, something within Larry's innermost self told him to look directly ahead, and he saw what appeared to be this oval-shaped distortion in the air, very similar to the way heat waves rise from the hot pavement. This strange oval just slowly shrunk and shrunk until it vanished. Completely terrified and beside himself, he ran all the way back to his truck as fast as he could, having no idea who he was going to tell or what he was going to say. And for a long time after this, he never told anybody, but suffered from horrific nightmares from this experience. Interestingly, that same trail is still hiked by many today, but there haven't been any reported experiences like Larry's. Or should I say, not exactly. Apparently, during the summer of 1980, several hikers had reported strange magnetic anomalies around the Mount Saddle Blanket area, affecting compasses and other hiking equipment. Could this just be attributed to mineral deposits? And 3 days before Larry's experience, Jim Wilkes, who's a seasoned trail maintenance worker, was documenting highly unusual dead zones along the same section of the Molalla Trail. He had been marking trees for removal when he entered an area where his radio completely stopped working. When he stepped back about 20 feet, the radio functioned normally again. Wilkes had marked the location in his logbook to have the power lines checked for any interference, but utility workers who investigated found no electrical anomalies. The Molalla Trail was eventually rerouted slightly in 1983 for what official records listed as terrain stability concerns. However, some historians noted that this section of the trail had been specifically avoided by the Molalla tribe centuries earlier, who had marked it on their own maps as a place where the air becomes strange. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment below strange air, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we just kind of deep dive into odd cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Slap that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. And never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.